So good morning, welcome everybody. We will conduct this talk in English. We are honored to host today at this online talk my colleague Vlaste Jalušič, a political scientist at the Peace Institute in Ljubljana, and our colleague Bulgarian political scientist Ivan Krastev, one of the most important European public intellectuals. The title of this talk is War and Peace in Europe, and Vlaste will discuss with Ivan many relevant issues of today's European politics. Ivan Krastev is the chairman of the Center for Liberal Strategies and permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. He is a founding board member of the European Council on Foreign Relations and a member of the Board of Trustees of the International Crisis Group, a member of the board of directors of GlobSec. He was a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times many years and is the author of several books we listed in the invitation. Ivan is also the winner of the Jean Amery Prize for European essay writing in 2020. And my colleague Vlaste Jalušič is scientific advisor and founder of the Peace Institute. As a full professor, she also lectures at the Faculty of Arts on nationalism, racism, and gender policy. She received her PhD in political science in '96 from the University of Vienna and is the author and translator of books, articles, and chapters on women movement, feminism, equality, political theory, violence, war, collective crime, and is excellent connoisseur of Hannah Arendt writing. As a long-time activist against discrimination and for gender equality, she has been involved in many feminist networks and human rights activities. Vlaste and Ivan will talk now around 45 minutes, and then we will open floor for questions. So Vlaste and Ivan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Brankica, and thank you very much for organizing this and Ivan to be ready for this talk. So I was wondering how to start actually, but then, you know, just by accident, today is the 9th of May. So it's the day of the victory over fascism, National Socialism. So it's interesting maybe to think about this present moment in Europe, and to go back from here, you know, the question maybe, you know, what can we celebrate, you know, today? Can we celebrate this day really? I mean, in the EU recently there were elections in Hungary, France, in Slovenia. Germany has now a new Chancellor Scholz. Yesterday, there were elections in Northern Ireland with a new result, of course. There was the last wave of COVID behind us, and there is the bloody war taking place in Ukraine right now, which has immediately turned our attention away from the focus on pandemic and opened a totally new horizon of crisis. So my question would be, even for you, I've read, and already in 2013 you wrote that the Ukrainian crisis will lead to identity building in Europe, in Ukraine, and even more extreme in Russia. So how do you see this situation with this war right now, you know, and do we have anything to celebrate?
No, of course, May 9 looks very different, depending where you think about it. For Europe, basically 1945 was perceived as kind of a breaking of a certain tradition, and it's not by accident that Tony Judd entitled his book Post-War, because the idea was that the European project was on one level born out of the ruins of the World War II, because all the founding members of the EU were countries defeated in the war. So it was very much about the union of the defeated. But secondly, the idea was that the major war is not possible in Europe. And this is why even during the dissolution of Yugoslavia, it was such a strong idea to help that, oh, but this is coming from the past. And now we have a major war. So for Europe, May 9 means that the idea that no major war is possible in Europe and the Europe is a post-war is not true. Even more, Europeans started to feel very much as in a pre-war situation, particularly the fear of the nuclear war. I was in Germany recently. It's so strong. It's back after 30 years totally absent. It's totally differences on the post-Soviet space. In a certain way, out of the disintegration of the Soviet Union, one of the very important symbolic capital that remains was Soviet victory in the World War II. And it was very much appropriated by Russia. If you're going to see all the parades and all the talk about the war was about this. And now you have the war in Ukraine, on which on one level, Russia is using the denazification discourse in order to justify what they're doing. And on the other side, basically you can see how every day the Ukrainians are making this war as their great patriotic war. So they're totally reappropriating the Soviet legacy. Now, basically, the Ukrainians are treating them as the Red Army versus the Nazi. And this is very strong if you see in the discourse of Zelensky yesterday. So in May 8th, basically the Ukrainians said what never against means for us. Well, there is an again. And for the first time in Russia, you have a parade in which there is not a single foreign leader. The only leaders invited is the Donetsk and Lugansk republics. So I do believe as a result of it, something very important has been dramatically changed. If before 1945 was a commonplace shared memory by all Europeans, nevertheless, of course, there was differences. This is not the case anymore.
Maybe we can go a little bit back, and I would like to turn to some of your most influential thesis analysis that you've made in your books, where you are proceeding from the 1989 break with the communist socialist regimes. And I see two important conclusions that you've made from that break. One was that the East started to imitate a model that was perceived to be the winning combination, namely liberal democracy, while that model was actually already conditioned by the Cold War situation all the time. And the other is that at the end of this imitation, the model itself was deeply affected by it. This became the most explicit and the most debated in the case of the US and with the phenomenon Trump. But there were so many hopes, both in East and West, invested into 1989 change. However, the democratic leaders who turned out to become there were these leaders who turned out to become the worst autocrats. And we've seen this in many countries, in Hungary, also in Slovenia, of course. Is this the logic of revolutions, even non-violent? In my opinion, this also reminds us on African anti-colonial struggles and post-colonial developments. So you wrote about, oh, sorry.
Yeah.
So my question would be, what did the Central East position do wrong after 1989?
No, listen, it's even not about right and wrong. It's about certain type of expectations. And one of the expectations was that it is enough basically for the communism to disappear and liberal democracy is the natural state of society. And it was very much shared. It was shared in the West, it was shared on the East. And in my view, here was the three illusions that I found kind of the most important to understand certain type of developments. One was very much the illusion of the West. And the illusion was that this is going to change, but the West is going to remain the same. In a certain way, I do believe that many Western democracies didn't understand to what extent their own political regimes, their economic regimes had been very much preconditioned on the Cold War. The fact that basically you had the Soviet Union that was appealing to the workers and basically saying, we are the power of the workers was very important. So as a result of it, basically, the Western democracies really tried to put a lot of effort to keep their own workers on their side. And this part of the social contract, and this was very much also the political logic of the Western welfare state, in which you basically want to be sure that the loyalty of your working class is going to be on your side in this confrontation with the Soviet East. The second is, when I say imitation, people basically try to see, oh, does it mean that the West colonized the East? I don't believe it, because we wanted to be like the West, at least what I remember Bulgaria in the 1990s. it could be different, for example, in Slovenia and others, because Yugoslavia was in a slightly different position than the classical Eastern Bloc countries. But for us, in a certain way, we expected that in 10 years, we're going to have the standard of living of Austria. We expected that this is enough for basically the Communist Party to lose power and everything is going to change. So many people perceive the transition as a kind of a migration of the East to the West. And this is one of the things that I do believe people kind of always underestimate. After every revolution, people leave the countries of the revolution, but normally this is the defeated party. This is the White Russians that left Russia after the Bolshevik Revolution. Funnily enough, after 1989, it was the liberals who left first, because if the West is the future of the East, go to the future. Go to the West. And I do believe that this major migration waves, which was very strong in places like Bulgaria or Romania or even Poland, Hungary, also explains part of the things happening. And the third level is that imitating somebody is very natural, but this is also something very painful. And we know it very well with the second generation of migrants, that suddenly the very fact that I want to be like you also means that probably I recognize that you're better than me, and this type of recognition and also losing my uniqueness and my tradition is becoming very painful. And this is where leaders like Mr. Orban or Mr. Kaczynski start to play. And they played because what happened in 1989 were two processes at the same time. This was a kind of the end of the Cold War, the end of communism, but it was also the end of kind of a long decolonization that started with the emergence of all the states. So this is why the nationalists and liberals have been in a coalition in all of these countries. Mr. Kaczynski did not change his views for the last 30 years. He was in 1989 where he is now. He was a traditional Polish nationalist, and he was in a coalition with the Polish liberals because he wanted to get out of the Soviet Empire. But then his idea of sovereignty, his idea of what it means to be sovereign, what is the meaning of the nation state, was very much different than some of his liberal colleagues like Geremek, Michnik, and others. So this coalition collapsed. And it collapsed because decolonization is very much also about collective identities. This is very much about kind of a challenging the idea of the universalism and pathological fear of everything that basically looks like an empire. Be it something, any type of universalism looks dangerous. Be communism, the Catholic Church, the liberalism, the human rights, the idea that I should have a space of my own and this space of my own should be defended. And in the case of Central and Eastern Europe, because of the ethnic nature of our states, quite a lot of this basically space of our own was very much defined in ethnic terms. Because one of the things that happened in Central and Eastern Europe is that if you look the map, the ethnocultural map of Europe in the 1900, you're going to see that the Habsburg Europe was the most culturally and ethnically diverse in Europe. And if you look at the same map in year 2000, you're going to see that this country was the most ethnically homogeneous. So during this period of time, basically people has been moving in Europe. But in Eastern Europe, basically, this movement of people ended with much more ethnic homogeneity than with much more diversity. It was different in the West because of decolonization, because of basically labor migration in the 1960s and 70s. But in 1939, 1/3 of the population of Poland were not ethnic Poles. They were Germans, they were Jews, they were Ukrainians. Then during the war, the Jews was destroyed and the Germans have been expelled and the Ukrainian territory have been put as part of the Soviet Union. So I'm telling this story because this created this situation in which after 1989, you ended up started with the liberal promise in many countries with the regimes that basically made illiberalism as their official ideology, like in the case of Hungary, and basically starting war of anything that sounds universalist.
So can this teach us something important about the liberal democratic model? You mentioned right before that, you know, that there was no problem for connecting liberalism and nationalism at that time. And then if we turn, you know, to the question of the phenomenon Trump, for example, you know, what are the roots of that phenomenon? And what can we learn regarding this from the US experience?
This is a great question. And of course, American story is slightly different than the Hungarian or the Polish stories. But there is one important thing, in my view, when we talk about liberal democracy. Liberal democracy is preconditioned on the idea of the political community, which is not contested. We know who are we, and on the basis of this, we basically start to organize ourselves. So strangely enough, like the old monarchy, basically democracies has two bodies. One is, particularly in many of the countries, quite very much ethno-national. In the case of the United States, it's the white body of the American democracy. The other body comes as a result of the elections. Majority is produced every elections, basically, and it's different and it is changing. But till recently, the idea was that this changing body of democracy cannot challenge the eternal body of democracy that is very much ethnic at its nature. Nobody can understand Trump's phenomena if it is not going to understand the demographic fears of the white Americans that basically they're using their majority status. And this is an interesting story because there was an interesting psychological studies that have been done in the United States. You have two groups of people, basically the same profile, and one of them were given the results of the statistical predictions that in year 2044, the basically United States is going to be the minority-majority society, which means that white Americans, in the way you're defining them now, because as you know, how you define it is very different, they're not going to be the majority group, and the other don't know these results. And then you try to poll these groups and trying to see how they respond to the idea of rights of the minorities and who should be in power and so on, and you see a much more conservative reactions on the side of the people who try to imagine demographic future in which their own group is losing majority. And you can see this in many places. Zemmour in France is a classical example of this demographic fear. So suddenly our society is basically inhabited by two groups that have a totally different kind of a political vision. So one is very much young progressives who fear basically climate and who fear that they're not going to be alive on Earth. And others very much preoccupied with demographic fears who fear that they're not going to be alive for us. And kind of this type of groups are the one that you can see on the streets. And they have a totally different idea of what is the threat of the future and totally different idea of what is we. And in my view, this kind of demography also explains demographic fears. By the way, some of them could be totally unrealistic, not based on the right projections, but projection starts to play the same role. And you can see during the COVID how strong basically projections have been shaping our expectations. Even in the Russia-Ukrainian war, 3 months before the war, the Russian president 3 times made a statement which nobody was asking him for. He said if it was not for the revolution, if it was not for the World War II, there were going to be 500 million Russians in the world. So this idea is that you're losing population, you have a demographic trend, you have an aging and shrinking population, and as a result of it, Ukrainians should be turned into Russians because you don't have enough Russians in the world. And Belarusians should be turned into Russians. So I had the feeling that demographic fears explain quite a lot of what we're seeing, particularly in a small societies. Bulgaria is a great example of this. Listen, for the last 30 years, Bulgaria lost 2 million people. In 1989, there were 9 million Bulgarians, and then now they're less than 7 million. And the result is a relatively low birth rates, but nothing dramatic on this, but shorter life expectancies than in the West Europe, and the big out migration. So this story is when people said, oh, the East Europeans fear migration. No, part of our kind of trauma is not coming out of the fear of migrants, but the fear of those who left us. Are they going to come back? Why they're not coming back? What is happening with these kids who do not have a common language with their grandparents? I know that the migration outflow is much lower in places like Slovenia. But listen, in places like Romania, for 10 years, they lost around 15% of the population, and 70% of them are people younger than 40. So these kind of aging, depopulated countries created the feeling of being a loser, even if your standard of living has been improved, even if because of the European money, the roads are better. So, and of course, some people are real losers in more than one sense. I mean, also their incomes are lower and their life of life and opportunities are low. But at least this is part of the story that I do believe was normally missed in trying to understand the factors also for explaining Trump's elections. Because in 2016, Trump said something which is quite important. He said, if you're not going to elect me now, Republicans are never going to win anymore because the Democrats opened the borders for migrants and these migrants are going to vote for them. So this is not going to be that we are going to elect the government, but the government is going to elect their own people by giving voting rights and migrants and so on. So this is the famous Brechtian promise. And of course, this is a fiction, and by the way, it's a fiction also how people are going to vote when they're going to get their voting rights, as we know, but it was the mobilizing cry, which probably explains part of his support among the white, particularly white male population.
This brings me actually right to the next questions that I have, because I really liked when I've read your sentence, and I'm quoting now, that at the heart of populist support is not a fear of a borderless world, but the fear of doctorless towns. And that is where you spoke about Bulgaria, you know, about these trends that you mentioned right now. So I will immediately link this to the Hannah Arendt thesis in The Origins of Totalitarianism, where she said that Nazism built its ideological horizon on real problems.
Yeah.
So, and let's say some analysts who are very critical of liberal democracy today argue that liberal democracy is actually not a cure, but a source of populism and fascism, actually. So what you already spoke about this in what you said now, but I would still ask this question once more. So what are the roots of the populist trend, both in East and West? So is it now this demographic question and the question of who is going to be the winner and who's going to be the loser? So what is at the heart of populist political support for fascism? Is it the loss of intellectual potential that, you know, these countries have suffered, of course, because, you know, if there is no one, I would say, clever who can lead the government, you know, you have no choice, actually. So is it an influence of intellectuals on politics, loss of trust? Or maybe also the right-wing appropriation of the language that was, after the Second World War, used by the left, let's say Gramsci, etc.
No, listen, probably there are more sources. And by the way, like with gardening, populism can be a very local phenomenon, what manages to mobilize in a certain countries. But there are several things that are obvious and it might be much more common. One is, if you look on the last elections, European elections on Europe, or if you're going to see any major surveys of European political values, you're going to see that the major divide in Europe is not between East and West or North and South. The major divide is between big urban centers and what basically the French are going to call periphery. So this is one thing, and listen, and living in some of these places, when you say that the problem is real, it is a real problem. Listen, I was lucky to be born when I was born, because if you're a young person being born in some of these kind of distant places in Bulgaria these days, the chance that you're going to have a better education and to end up with more opportunities is even less than it was in 1970s and 1980s in Bulgaria. So I'm saying this because there is also no critical mass of people. You have this kind of a division, and this division is very, very important. So societies are not simply losers and winners of how much they earn, but also where they stay and what kind of an opportunity they were given. The second thing that also happened is that you look at the society, be Bulgaria, probably the same as Slovenia. If you're a young person, and you have been voted 3 times for different political parties, hoping that they're going to be a change and basically going for the change and trying to make your country look different. And even if you very much believe in a liberal democracy, the first time what you'll do is say, why try to make Bulgaria like Germany when I can simply go to Germany? And this classical Hirschman's exit voice story, in which exit is so easy in the European Union. It is so easy basically to change your place, and this is going to much more radically change your life. Nevertheless, how much you're voting, because for the voice you need so much a collective effort. So paradoxically, nationalism and loyalty to the place was very important for the voice option to work. According to Hirschman, exactly because I'm not ready easily to leave my country, I'm staying and trying to change it and doing this. So paradoxically, the moment when the liberal values, particularly with the younger generations, were much more spread, for these people, exit was much less difficult than for previous generation. For example, in 1980s, after the martial law in Poland, the Polish government offered the leaders of Solidarity, if they're going to leave the country, that they're going to release 6,000 people from prison. And this was one of the very important debates within the leadership of Solidarity. And some people were ready to do it. But then, in fact, it was Michnik who said, I'm not leaving. And he said, listen, this is like what happened in 1968 with the Jews leaving. They tried to show that we basically don't care about the place. And the moment when we show that we don't care the place, we're never going basically to be legitimate to represent the Polish nation. So then basically the leadership of Solidarity, these 7 people that have been offered this option, decided that they're not leaving, they're staying in prison, even at the cost that other 6,000 people are going to stay in prison. Listen, this conversation is not going to be the same anymore. Nobody is in prison, and basically for people, it's easy to go to study abroad, to work abroad. And listen, even now I'm talking from Vienna, not talking from Sofia. So this makes also for the liberal democracy very difficult to function, because you need a kind of a level of loyalty that I'm staying, that this place is so important for me, that I'm never going to leave it. That basically, in my view, is missing. Paul Berman, not Paul Berman, but this German singer, Dissident Berman, has a song in which he said, you cannot love what you cannot leave. But also kind of you cannot change something that you can so easily leave. And I do believe this is also make it very difficult. It's very strong and very clear in the case of some of East European countries, in which after losing the elections, for example, in Hungary, the young Hungarians simply leave the country. They're not going to wait for the next elections. They don't want to leave.
So may I interrupt you?
Yes, you can. You should.
I have a sub-question now, because it's interesting, because before I said, what is the connection with the liberalism and nationalism. So do you think that now, after you said this, that one of the problem is that there is not enough, I won't say nationalism, but patriotism, a feeling of belonging, and that living in democracy is understood in this, let's say, a very superficial liberal way, as that you can be free-floating being who just moves anywhere in the horizon of the Western, in the Western horizon, of course, because otherwise you can't just move anywhere. Only if you have a Western passport you can potentially move anywhere. So is there a problem with populism nowadays, and populist and nationalist parties, that they really push the button, which is actually so important in order to think about democracy at all, that it needs a space to be to take place?
Totally. No, listen, they're touching on at least 2 buttons that work. One is, by the way, Isaiah Berlin always made a point that in English language, feel home and feel free are synonymous. When basically you're saying to person feel like at home, this means that you should feel free. So the assumption was that you can feel really free only at home. So this kind of a loyalty, this level of patriotism, which is really belonging to a place, it is not about nationalism in a traditional sense, but it means that this place is more important for you than any other place. I do believe this is very important, because if you see what is part of the message of the populists, particularly it was so clear during the global financial crisis, when they said, look at these meritocratic elites, all these technocrats who are telling that they should govern because they're more competent. But the problem is that when the crisis is going to come, they can leave. Because you can be a banker in Slovenia, but with the same easiness, you can be a banker in Austria if you're professional enough. Why we, the populists, we're promising you not that we're better, but that we're going to stay with you, that we are not leaving. And in my view, this is interesting because in Bulgaria, I noticed the following things. 10 years ago, when you claim that you speak a foreign language, this in a certain way helps you in your political career. You say, I speak a foreign language, which means that I know the outside world better. It also means that I put an effort to learn a foreign language. Now you're going to have a political leaders who said, do you know what? Vote for me. I don't speak a foreign language. I cannot end up in Brussels tomorrow. For me, the only place where I can have a career is here. So this kind of a populists trying to weaponize the loyalty to the place, that the fact that we are not the one who are living, in my view, became a very effective kind of attack and criticism to the meritocratic elites, which were perceived as too mobile, too cosmopolitan, and not really caring very much about the place.
I do think this also opens the questions, you know, which are so important, but are right now not on the agenda because there is the war going on in Ukraine, and they actually somehow vanished behind this curtain of war, like the question of the climate change, the question of the, let's say, preserving the nature. I will speak in these terms because this is also related and it is connected with the question of the place where we live, basically. So it's only from this place that we can fight, you know, to prevent that the trees are cut down, or, you know, to protect the lake to be dried out, etc., etc. So I do think this brings us to these questions, of course. And then now we see what's going on in Europe, and these questions are actually somehow blurred behind, you know, questions about whether we will get the sources of energy from somewhere else than from Russia. And then we saw now the last elections, which might give us some kind of hope, but the question is where these things will actually, in which direction these things will turn, because Macron has won the elections. And Slovenia was not urbanized, which was the fear of the last years during Janša's government. So there is a relief, it seems. However, Le Pen is not going to vanish from the political map, neither will Janša. Yeah. And of course, Orban won the elections. Now, it's interesting in Slovenia, and that might be an experiment, but I would so much hope that this will become true. So the winner of the Slovenian elections, Golob, promises a close cooperation with civil society, which has really bring about the change, and seems to offer some kind of experiment beyond party dominance. Yet, on the other hand, he comes from the top management, and we do not know where this will really bring us. So the question is, you know, can we change the kind of the government we have? What kind of government do we need? Is this a liberal democracy as we have known it by now, which obviously cannot oppose populism and fascism? It cannot be a bulwark against them, maybe even on the contrary. So if you would try to think from your experience, let's say from 1989 until now, we are almost the same generation. So what would you say? What kind of government do we need?
It's interestingly enough, I always believe, and of course this is really trivial, but at the heart of democracy is that it's experimental society. And this is why I was never very much kind of taken by all this talk about good governance, that people know how it's going to be done and not to be done. Obviously, society is looking for somebody taking care of certain problems, but also sensibilities, because of course, Mr. Orban manages to be re-elected, but he also created a system in which it's quite difficult to be defeated, because the level of a state capture, which is existing in Hungary, is quite important. So I don't believe that his model can be easily exported. Nevertheless, obviously he believes something else. Poland is like the United States. Poland is a very divided society. And it's very divided because you had a very powerful church, because you have a lot of people living in this kind of areas which are not part of the urban centers, because you have a very important generational divide. And in my view, in every different society, there is a certain type of problems that are going to shape the political system at this moment. And one of the levels is, can civil society basically influence? Well, not of that, but can you influence? Can basically these voices can be heard? How people have the capacity to negotiate? Do you have a capacity for self-correction? And from this point of view, populism, in a certain way, injected certain level of a reality, and this is why this is not an imitation game anymore. For example, in Slovenia, probably you're going to have, if you're lucky, a coalition between kind of a management culture on one level and much more civil society participation story, and it is going to work because society cohesive enough, you know each other well enough, and you have a common enemy. In Bulgaria, we have also a similar experiment, which does not need to succeed because you have a younger generation, people who came from outside. It's even not the managers, which is quite interesting, but much more people who start with startup companies. This is also kind of a tricky issue because the state is not a startup. And then basically, but then societies are learning certain things about themselves. And from this point of view, Ukraine is a great example. Listen, Ukraine was a very dysfunctional society. They never managed to get an authoritarian consolidation, even during Yanukovych, because from this point of view, it was very different than Russia. But now when I'm talking to the people, you can see how in the moment of crisis, three things happened that nobody expected. One is, first of all, President Zelensky has a popularity of around 25% before the war started. There was a lot of negative approval rating, but then comes a moment, and he fit the moment. The moment when he refused to leave Kiev to go to Lviv, when he said to the Western advisors, I don't need a right, I need an ammunitions. He was transformed into a national leader that nobody expected him to become. At the end of the day, he was a comedian actor. And then you have this very divided Ukrainian society, which everybody is telling me, and there was a lot of journalists I talked about, he said, in all these small towns in Ukraine, you have all centers of power. I mean, the police, the criminal boss, the business, but also some of the major civic activists every day deciding what they should do in order to keep the town functioning, because, for example, the town is cut of almost everything. So this level of self-organization that comes with the crisis, you cannot, first, you cannot basically predict it. It can happen or not happen. And secondly, of course, you don't know how it's going to end up. It does not mean that Ukraine tomorrow necessarily is going to be a flourishing liberal democracy. It can go in different ways. But I have the feeling that insisting on the experimental nature of democracies and people just comparing between the experiments in different places, probably this is the best that can happen. And it's not one normative ideal that can be imposed on everybody. You know what you don't want. You want the elections to be competitive. You want to be sure that the government can be defeated. You want to have a media environment which is basically pluralistic enough so people can get an information that they want. But out of this basic story, exactly what kind of government and exactly what kind of policies, I don't believe this is a very kind of particular for a very particular countries and context. I don't believe that one economic policy fits everybody.
This is so you are actually, if I can make my own interpretation, if I allow myself this, so you're actually telling us that in spite of the fact that every war is catastrophe, so what is going on in Ukraine is a catastrophe, that behind that the war is also changing social dynamics radically there. I mean, we've seen this in other wars as well. I mean, we've seen that after the war, things usually change, not always in the bad, in the good manner, but sometimes we have new things that emerge during the war. You know, so okay, I might I might think about this. So because
listen, Soviet Union is the best example of this. In 1945, when the soldiers came back from the war, they had the feeling that they contributed to victory. They were victors. And this is why nobody can understand that basically post-Stalinist transformation of the Soviet Union if you don't understand that you cannot govern people that have won the war, that have died, that have been wounded in the same way basically you have been grounded before. And in my view, this idea of a self-respect, dignity, I want to be totally treated totally differently. In any conflict, you're going to the minister and said, and I'm not going to allow to teach me. I have been dying for this country. And I do believe this is a sentence which was very important. Charles Tilly has this famous point. He said, states makes wars, but wars make states. And in a certain way, this also idea of a collective identity. Ukrainian society is also ethnically very diverse. There are different groups of people, you know, there is a quite big Russian-speaking population and so on. And then what gives you an identity is a conflicts. And these conflicts in which you're really sacrificing something that is of a major value. And I do believe this is things that you know better than me, because in a certain way, even these identities, which came after the dissolution of Yugoslavia, could not be taken for granted. They were very different in different parts of the Yugoslav space. It could have been very different. Unfortunately, the thing that it is also, it is destroying identity. It is destroying certain things. It's make people. Also, it can make it like with the decolonization in Africa, you can end up with a national liberation leaders that turn out to be cruel dictators. But this is changing the social fabrics in the way I don't believe very few things can change it, because unfortunately, war is a participatory exercise.
I mean, what we actually see is what we haven't seen probably in Europe since the Second World War. Maybe since, I mean, in the region of former Yugoslavia, we've seen that. But however, there is this emergence of the situation where the community is bigger than a single human life. And basically in a traditional way, I mean, in terms of the, let's say, political tradition, Western political tradition, this is actually a very political, I would say, circumstance, let's say, where things can develop that are not usually developed otherwise. But this also opens one last question that I would have for you, and I would move to the question of pandemic actually with this and the experience of pandemic, because there was a question of human life or human lives in the first place which was asked. And your main point when you were analyzing pandemic seems to be similar to something that the German sociologist Hartmut Rosa wrote in his book about the acceleration of temporal structures in the 20th century. So basically, your main point was that the pandemic intensified certain trends that were already there. So maybe you can tell us more about these trends. What has changed? What have we learned from pandemic, if anything? What does this tell us about the crisis?
Listen, very much, yeah, I don't believe that the pandemic moved us in a different direction, but first of all, the intensity of the experience. This is the first global crisis in a literal sense. Over a period of 2 weeks, basically, the world had been closed. From China to Slovenia, basically, suddenly there is no flights, and this goes to every individual. And in my view, this was quite important, because then society should redefine what they're doing. And governments have been in a trend, in a trap. I was really surprised to see how governments started to talk about death as being something unnatural. You have the moments in which you have the feeling that the governments are promising people that they'll never die. And then you have the idea of the solidarity, which was totally redefined, because in order to have a solidarity with other people, I should not meet them, I should not touch them. And I'm saying this because this crisis, very much like the war in a different way that as the war in Ukraine, was a crisis of globalization. Suddenly, basically, you see a major deglobalization, supply chains have been disrupted. People started to talking about onshoring, that we should keep our production close to our markets. Now, after the war in Ukraine, people start to talk about friendshoring, that you should keep our production in friendly countries. So obviously, but then the moment when people have been closed in their rooms, suddenly we start to live in a common world. Because I was sitting in a Bulgarian city, we went back to Bulgaria for the first months of the pandemic, as you're changing the TV channels. I don't speak most of the languages, but I know exactly what they were talking about, because all news channels were talking about the pandemic and how many people are basically infected and how many people are dying. And people who living in this Bulgarian village who have never been interested in anything outside of Bulgaria or Europe started to be interested in what's happening in America, in Brazil, and others. So this was this strange story in which you had the closing and opening at the same time. Also, for me, what was interesting with the pandemic is that you have the idea of the sovereignty, which was quite important in also in a war. Come back, but this was the sovereignty of individual. You have all these very strong anti-vaxxer movements and what it means to be sovereign, and basically the anti-vaxxers borrowing the slogans of the feminists about my body and this and that, and this became a big issue because in a country like Bulgaria, we didn't get more than 35% of vaccinated population. So the level of mistrust was so strong. So then this is what it means to be sovereign for the individual, what you can allow government to do or not.
Christian, may I challenge you from having you last time at the talk on public broadcaster, and now you are listening from Denmark, this issue of how do you see this European politics in the middle of the war in Ukraine? How does it look from Denmark?
You could say, I don't know if you ask about specific the relation to the war in Ukraine.
Yes, how it is reported and viewed in Denmark, in Danish politics.
The war is watched, like in most Western European countries anyway, very, very anti-Russia and pro-Ukraine. I mean, the international medias, the Danish newspapers, the Danish public broadcaster are very, very one-sided in the watch. I have made it a custom for myself personally to find not the ordinary media, but find some, online media from different people. And I'm watching now Indian television, Australian television, and individual outlets who are trying to watch the conflict in Ukraine or the war in Ukraine from both sides. And originally, I'm a political scientist working with the international system, and from that perspective, most of the blame for, of course, it's Russia who is the attacker, but the background for it is very much rooted in 100 years perspective for Russia in their view on the West, and all the times they have been attacked from the West. So that's I think it's frustrated that from my perspective, the West and specific United States are having a proxy war which actually is completely destroying Ukraine now. And I'm very pessimistic talking about the perspective of how to find a peace. International conflicts have an inbuilt dynamo who's escalating automatically. But peace and negotiations are something much more difficult to get started. And I can't really see the perspective in forces behind the work for finding a way toward the peace and the compromise.
And for the people in the room, Christian Nissen was general director of public broadcast in Denmark. As he said, is also political scientist himself. Maya, you wanted to say something? Maya Skalar.
Yes, hi, thank you very much. Yeah, I thought in the meantime, when we are waiting for Ivan to come back, I might, and possibly this is even a question to Slovenian participants more than to any other. So I'm Maya Skalar, I'm Slovenian, but I live currently in Vienna as well. And, you know, I've been with high hopes and following and actively following the election campaign. And I was really positively surprised by the young generation waking up, and especially Institute of 8th of March influence on the record high election participation of 70%. And I was just thinking to get maybe from the participants, maybe from Ivan if he joins, any answer to the question of how we can use this momentum, how we can capture this woken up young generation going forward. So in considering real solutions, real problems, that they started to pose these questions in their visits of the small towns in Slovenia and so on, because Slovenia is very much centralized too. I mean, everything, Ljubljana is everything. I'm from Murska Sobota, I know, I have felt that a lot. And how do we use this decentralized momentum with young Slovenians?
Maybe I could say something I offer myself, because I was just raising these questions and also thinking about them actually. I mean, it was amazing to see in Slovenia, how people were mobilized. And not only that they were mobilized for elections, but I think the main point was when they started to prepare a very viable and serious political and legal solutions. So that was, in my opinion, the most important point. There were several laws prepared by the civil society actors, where people were participating in that. And these were not, just laws that were not competent. They pulled in people who were competent. So that, I would say, lawmaking activity was so important. And now I think the main question for the new government is, of course, if they want to succeed. I think that's the main thing that they should ask themselves. If they want to succeed in this project, they should continue this cooperation and take these proposals really, really seriously. If they're not going to, I mean, this means that we will just have a repetition of what we've seen before. And I must say that I'm trembling while looking at what's going on right now with the constitution of the new ministries, new government, etc. And who's going to be there. Especially this is important. While on the one side, what Ivan was saying before, it's so important to have these new ideas and, let's say, new blood in the political space. On the other hand, we all know that politics on the everyday basis is a hard work, and that you need resources and people who are willing to do that. So on the one hand, it's important that the government will continue this cooperation. On the other hand, there is a question how much energy is left in these groups and with these people to continue this, because it's not only at the time of the election when you do this, you have to keep going. And I think that's the main question, in my opinion. What Slovenia, as long as Slovenia is concerned right now. But it gives hope to me. It was amazing to see, that from all this movement, it was not the anti-party sentiment which developed, but these ideas of cooperation, of participation, of preparing solutions, and that's, I think, the most important thing. Where but I'm just trembling and afraid that this won't work on the long term. So I would want to have a little bit more of discussion, especially about what Christian has started with, namely the question, if you can reach the peace. And, I haven't heard everything, but I do think that maybe we can also discuss this because I do not see very many efforts on the international scale, especially not any willingness willingness on the side of those powers who can bring about negotiations, that they do want negotiations. And that's the main problem, in my opinion.
Yes, we recently shared the interview with Noam Chomsky, also raising that issue of negotiations and who could initiate it, and is rejecting mainly the global powers like US or China are rejecting to go into that direction. And what about the fact how the war in Yugoslavia ended, with, again, particularly in Bosnia, with that Davos negotiations and peace agreement? Is something like that possible here? And while it's not happening, what are your thoughts, colleagues in the room? Josip, you are moving. Yes, please.
Yes, thank you for noticing. Hello, Vlasta and Olga and Lana, those that I recognize. You mentioned Dayton, probably not Davos, Dayton, of course, for Bosnia. And there is something interesting there in this dialogue between demographics and democracy, because the Dayton Agreement tends to solidify the positions of nations. So nations are protected, or rather Serbian, Croatian, and Bosniak nations. And right now we are looking at a situation in which demography has changed to an extent that makes that initial arrangement obsolete. So this is becoming increasingly the issue, and I think Bosnia should be one of the primary issues if we are discussing demographic shifts and the democratic effects of demographic shifts, regardless of the fact that it's obviously an imperfect arrangement, but nevertheless it is as it is. And I very much enjoyed. I have to thank Vlasta, and also, of course, the superstar has left, to him as well. This has been a very enjoyable talk to listen to. I have really enjoyed all of these parallels, parallels between staying and leaving, Solidarność refusing to leave Poland, Zelensky refusing to leave Ukraine. It's a perennial issue between going to a better place to work and study and become perhaps a better person, or staying. Where staying becomes almost suicidal. This is different from the Bulgarian and Croatian perspective, and indeed Bosnian perspective, than it is compared to Slovenian perspective. But this is an interesting contrast, and I do have a whimsical idea, if you will humor me for a minute. Godfather 2 has this wonderful scene where Frankie Pentangeli is betraying his Dawn, and he only is prevented in betraying his Dawn in the courtroom when his brother appears. Now, his brother is a mafioso from Sicily, so he refused to leave, and Frankie Pentangeli left for America and has become a very successful mafioso in America. And Frankie only needs to take a look into the eyes of his brother to prevent his own betrayal of Corleone. But in that, he accepts his own suicide. So he has gazed into the eyes of traditional values and accepted the suicidal route. And even in Zelensky's sentence, I don't need a ride, I need ammunition, there is a little bit of this. So there is this immensely attractive and dark theme underlying all of this contrast between the positive type of migration where you leave because you can leave, because you're free to leave wherever you can most assertively make yourself the best version of yourself, I guess, or economically be the best version of yourself. And on the other hand, you have this Gunnar Myrdal sort of backwash idea where immigration or emigration from an economic periphery is essentially the destruction of the periphery itself. So again, thank you very much.
Anybody else?
I think
Yes, Christian, please, and Spela then.
May I go back to the theme of the future of democracy and populism we talked about earlier, because from a Danish perspective, at least to my opinion, it's not in Denmark or the Nordic countries, the populist movements who is really the reason for the difficulties or crises we have in the democratic system in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. There have been or there are populist movements, and in Denmark it had a considerable political influence 10 years ago, but not anymore. The problem of the issue, to my opinion, is from a different, I will just take down my hand, come from a different direction. It's the Danish democracy, the democratic system is, look upon it from outside, very successful. Danes are happy with the society. There's enormous trust in government and so on. The government is also capable of making laws and changes and implement them. But the problem is that the political system and the political parties has lost the sense of direction and goals. They've become administrators. They're administrating a system. They don't really know where to go. And there's a historical reason behind that. The Danish democracy, the system was made during 50 years in the end of the 19th century. The constitution was from 1849, and then it took 50 years of very, very hard battles or conflicts between the bourgeoisie, the right side, and two important movements in Denmark, civil society movements. It was first the farmers who created the cooperatives and all that. And after 30, 40 years, they won in the beginning of the 20th century. And they took power, not only economically, also politically, culturally. So they were actually the ruling class in Denmark. And then when they got that power, they stopped being revolutionary. They became administrators. They wanted to keep the system they had created. Then came the second popular movement, the labor movement, and the Social Democratic Party. And they actually, during 30 years, established the welfare society in Denmark. They have all their goals and hopes fulfilled. And when they had reached that, they became conservative. They want to conserve the system they have. And now they have no more movements, no more ideas. The civil society has lost its influence on politics and in culture and so on. So the whole system has become an administrative machinery. And that is, to my opinion, not to say that populist movements is not a threat for democracy in a number of countries, but I think the situation in Denmark is more fundamental. And I think some of the same traits can be found in other Western European countries. And you can say that Macron in France became elected last time and wanted to make large reforms, but actually nothing really has come out of it. And democracy is not only a system where the one government can lose an election and a new government take office. It's also the ability of the state or the political system to establish itself, make reforms going in a certain direction, followed by popular movements. And that we have lost in Denmark. And that's actually what I'm working very much with now, to try to find out how to re-intervene and revive, give the political system a revival. But that's very, very, very difficult. Thank you.
And dangerous.
Yes, and I can say that, of course, congratulations for the election in Slovenia. And don't lose your hope because in Denmark, it took 50 years to establish a well-functioning democracy.
I wanted to go back to Ukrainian and Russian war and the media. I'm concerned about the decision taken by Ursula von der Leyen to blockade a couple of other media outlets, which I've been following media situation in Yugoslavia before the war, and I was very much concerned with the propaganda tricks and the whole stream that was channeled from Serbia. So in this situation again, I'm very much concerned about the possibility of the Western European media being channeled very much by the war circumstances and getting us just take anything the propaganda teams want us to see and to understand. So I'm also afraid that in such a situation, actually all the channels are being blocked, which may create some possibility of mutual understanding of the reasons, the fears that are there on both sides. And this again means lessening the possibility for any possibility, lessening the possibility of creating an atmosphere where peace negotiations could even start and perhaps find a way to block this war. So all in all, I would like to say that I'm afraid that propaganda is being a possibility of the way we are going to be informed. That's, if you have any comments on that, who does take this, the decision on the European level to block information channels on whichever side? If anybody has a response to that, I would like to hear it.
I will give a comment to that, because I think it's very, very scary that this is happening in the West, blocking Russian media. And I have been traveling in Eastern Europe both before 1989 and after, and talked with media people. And I have always said that in Denmark, the press is open, everybody is allowed to express their opinions, being their God or being their the devil. Some of the people I've talked about have been a bit skeptical, but there's hope. And now we see that Denmark, the authorities in Denmark, the whole EU, have now made this closing up of the media from the enemy, the propaganda media of Russia and so on. And it's terrible. And behind it is also some scary things in the debate in Denmark. There have been a couple of people with expert knowledge on the Russian culture, the Russian soul, the Russian understanding of what's happening, and just expressing that we have to understand the Russians. That word understand, although these people have said not to defend what they are doing, but we have to understand their way of thinking, the way we have to understand in any negotiation, in any conflict, everybody must try to understand the adversary to reach a compromise. But these people who are arguing for this has in Denmark been called Putinists. They are allied with Putin. They have been more or less squeezed out of the debate. So it's so one-sided. And this, as you mentioned, Spila, of closing the Russian media is one way of you're protecting your ears and your views, so you are not risking to come to understand what they're thinking on the other side. And that is one of the reasons that I'm so pessimistic, looking forward to one kind of a compromise leading to negotiations and peace.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that in addition to what Christian said, that's also the thing that is the most dangerous, I think, is that this all enables the demonization of Russia, and we've seen, you know, the results of the demonization in very many cases, and they're usually devastating because they bring about a complete non-understanding of what's going on. I mean, it's just this demonization accumulates. So it's always and this and this and this, and now we see with all these speculations about, you know, if Putin is mentally ill or if he's ill in any other way, etc., which is completely useless for any understanding of what's going on. Because I mean, but this brings about, you know, impossibility of discussing any peaceful solution, I think. And because there is a danger of nuclear war behind all this, I think this is the most dangerous thing. In this regard, I also watched the interview with Chomsky. I somehow agree with him when he is actually saying that here Europe made a very, very big mistake in its let's say he's talking about hysteria somehow, and not thinking about you know, what will be the consequences of not that the sanctions are not justified. They of course are, but the question is to differentiate between a rational sanction and the irrational, I would say, you know, saying that now we are not going to play Tchaikovsky, or now we are not going to have a lecture on Dostoevsky, or etc., etc. So, and I would go back to what Hannah Arendt said, for example, as an immigrant in United States, when she said, you know, what remains, the language remains, and my language is German. And she refused, you know, refused to give up on anything that is German as bad. So, and I think that is so important, you know, to say. And if we won't be able to say this publicly, then, I mean, we have no chance for any peaceful solution. And we are in a great danger, I think, all of us.
Yes, Wolfgang, please take the floor.
Yes, I would like to add a question. When I understood well Vlasta before about patriotism, so I have another perspective. I agree with what you say about rational, irrational ways of acting against Putin. But what I was quite preoccupied during the last years about populism and about the maneuvers of Russia Today and media influence, giving money to Le Pen and whatever, and to see a Europe which is very much organized in itself, preoccupied by its own preoccupations or affairs. So when we would agree that with the war in Ukraine, it's a war against democracy and democratic values, and it can have consequences for the Eastern NATO states, the border to Belarus and Ukraine and Russia. So the question would be, what are these values? Is it worth to talk about, or is it too dangerous to talk about thinking more about the Republican aspect of Hannah Arendt in Europe, to say we have civil societies, we have certain values which are more than only liberal, weak liberal values. So this would be my question to you as well as to Ivan, because Ivan is not coming from the political philosophy, but from political experience. And to put these things together would be, I think, quite interesting.
You addressed this question on me. I do think that the framing of this war as a war against democracy is already ideological framing. So if we frame it like this, then I don't think we can understand what's going on actually. I do not think that we can say that that is the war against democracy or the war against values, etc., etc. I do think we have to go much more behind that and think about more, I would say, to the ground questions. And I do think that to a certain extent, Ivan addressed them already. So I didn't think about, now you provoked me, Wolfgang. Wolfgang is my colleague in the same project when we think about political, about the questions of political concepts and also about what kind of government we are facing right now in the world and in Europe, etc., etc. So you caught me in the moment where I cannot explain this yet, but I will definitely try to. But I do think that that if we accept this wording, war against democracy, that we are already within the very Western liberal democratic ideology in terms of justification of what Europe and US, particularly US and Europe with the US, I would say, are doing right now, which is in fact preventing peace, not working towards peace, I would say, in all these elements. So I do think it's very territorial war, and I do think it's very geopolitical war in terms of who is going to gain what part of. It's not the war against, it's not the war for values, I would say, basically. But at this moment, I can't move further from saying that. So I will think about this, you know, to discuss this at our course in Dubrovnik in September, probably.
Yes, we have Ivan back. Yes.
I'm back from the dead, yeah. Sorry, I don't know what happened. And even our person who is doing the computers don't know what happened.
Yes, Vlasta, can you
I can wrap up what we discussed. So in the meantime, we discussed Slovenia and elections and what's going on, and we discussed Ukraine and the question of whether, you know, what's going on with the possibilities for any peace agreement and peace talks. And then there was a question of criticism against Europe closing down the access to the Russian media and how much this brings about non-understanding of the situation for all of us. And I tried to think about this demonization of Russia and Putin. And right now we were discussing the question Wolfgang opened, you know, about the question of, you know, what are Republican values when we talked about patriotism, if you remember, and you know, liberalism and patriotism. And he used the wording that this is the war against democracy. And I was questioning this, saying that I do think this is already framed by ideology, that is not war against democracy, but very geopolitical. So I don't know whether I wrapped up enough, but this was approximately the debate we were talking also about the, you know, the power of civil society and, you know, how much the Western governments are already only administrative governments where, you know, there are no new ideas, no new topics, no directions. For example, the Christian gave the example of Denmark and, you know, so many years of not having any direction, but just administration of things.
Sorry for missing all this. Everything that you have discussed was going to be very interesting for me to listen to. It's Just on two of this issue, I have something small to say. One is like you, I do believe that closing televisions is always a sign of weakness. And I was trying to see why we're doing this. Paradoxically, part of it obviously comes from the fear of the ethnic diasporas. So the Russian, because I'm a Russian speaker, and the Russian television is quite awful. So on this is true. And generally what happened in Russia in the last 2 months is a major change of the regime. Putin's regime, particularly till recently, and particularly before 2011, was not particularly repressive for the Russian standards. So you have kind of, if you're not particularly messing in politics and so on, it became extremely repressive in the last 2 months. It's not simply that they closed media, but they did two things that I never expected them to do. So now, if you're making a statement, which they decided not to like, you're going to be called foreign agent, even if you're not getting any money from outside. But what is even more important, all your family goes on foreign agent. Stalin was famous for saying that children are not responsible for their parents. Here suddenly, because they want to close the mouths of those who left the country and speaking from outside. And this changed the atmosphere dramatically. Secondly, they came with a legislation in which any anti-war effort, for example, if you're going to call it war, you're risking 15 years in prison. I'm not going to put everybody, but normally this was not the case. Normally, particularly, they're going to leave newspapers, which are just printed media. They always had a total control of the televisions, but never be so much interested about other things. And part of it is coming from insecurity, and part of it is coming from the fact that he was prepared for special operations and it ended up with war. The interesting story, and I have seen Russian presidents several times, and I have seen even in October, basically, people believe that this is a kind of a cynical a person who basically tells one thing outside and totally different things when they privately discussed. This is not true. In a certain way, he should be taken very literally. It's a very angry person who believes that it is the Russian right to unify all these lands. He believes that Ukrainians are going to see him as a liberator. And this is why there is a kind of a collapse of the world, because he believes that there is this pro-Western elite which are controlling the population, but when basically they see the Russian troops coming, this is going to be different. He's very much disturbed by certain type of things happening, particularly in the cultural sphere in the United States. He's obsessed with wokeism. And also, interestingly enough, totally on a feminist issue. For example, he believed that the fact that President Obama decided to put women in charge of Russia, I mean, the national security advisor was a woman, and basically the UN ambassador was a woman, that it was a sign of disrespect for Russia. He said he wanted to humiliate us. And this is serious. In a certain way, you can look at it as a joke, but this is a very interesting kind of a very, very, very interesting idea of the worldview, which is internalized by part of people around him. For Russian society, this war was total surprise, even for his own people. Some of his senior advisors were much more surprised by the war starting than we were. And this is why this kind of repression comes, because neither society nor the army was prepared for real fighting. Russian army is not doing well. And as a result of it, basically, this was the things that everybody was ready to recognize him, that probably his economy is not strong and here and there. And I'm saying this, and I'm going to end up on this. One of the very unfortunately tragic things that is going to happen is what is happening to the Russian language. I always believe that empires don't die on the battlefield. Empires die in the bookstores. And what I see in Vienna is a lot of Ukrainians whose major language is Russian, they don't want to speak Russian anymore. For them, this is perceived as a political statement. They feel betrayed by people speaking the same language. Secondly, after the Bolshevik Revolution, you're going to have many people on the left that were going to be interested to learn the language. Of course, you have also the power of the traditional Russian classical literature and movies and so on. And now you're going to end up in a situation in which kind of Russian language is going back to a national language too. And the same happened with the religion. The Orthodox Church, which was kind of an imperial church, the Russian church, Patriarch Kirill blessed the army to start an attack and destroying the cities in which 2/3 of the Orthodox Christians in Ukraine belong to the Moscow Patriarchate. So basically, he's blessing the army that is killing people that belongs to his constituency. So the Russian church, like Bulgarian and Serbian and others, is becoming simply a state church. There is no kind of universal appeal anymore. You don't care. And in my view, these are things that are going to outlive this war. Nevertheless, how it's going to end, nevertheless, when, I don't see this changing. This was so interesting to see, even here in Vienna, and I saw the same in Berlin. A lot of particularly better educated Russians, which are ready to speak with you on a broken English, even if they know that they speak Russian. And most of them try to explain to you that they're not the kind of 100% Russians, that they're, for example, Tatars or this and that. This kind of a dissolution of the Russian Empire based on language, because Russian language was the most important about the empire, is something that I found tragic in a way, but very important in the outcome of this war.
That is the what we were discussing, but also how all of this affects European democracy, you know, because there are definite consequences also, all these sanctions and this relation to media freedom. This cost us also very much in terms of citizenship of Europe.
No, totally. And this is the beginning, because they're going to be economic consequences. Listen, this goes together with the COVID. As I told you, I come from a country in which the level of mistrust is so high. We have a very high level of excess death. And you have, this is the paradox. You can see it in some other East European countries. By the way, Hungary also didn't do it all well during the pandemic. But you have a country in which people believe that they have a very bad health system and our hospitals have been overwhelmed and so on. At the same time, basically, they don't want to vaccinate. And this is not because of a strong anti-vaccine movement, neither on the left or on the right, that are traditionally present, like in Germany, Austria, but simply because they are not able to trust anybody. And in my view, these societies which are totally shaped by mistrust, and as a result of it, kind of ungovernable, is one of the things that we all are going to face. And of course, governments are trying to use the war in order to mobilize people's sentiment and so on. I don't believe it's going to work. For example, in the United States, you have a common position when it comes between Republicans and Democrats when it comes to Ukraine, but it does not reflect at all any rising support for President Biden. So the war, unlike in the previous times, the war is not basically bridging the divide. It's not creating any type of a social cohesion. It's interesting how it's going to work in Poland, but this is an interesting story. The external enemy is not important anymore. The civil war within the society, particularly the American, is more important. And in my view, when Biden is fighting Putin, he probably believes that he's fighting Trump, because in a certain way, this is what you see as the real enemy is the one that you fight with balance, not with bullets.
Vlasta, please continue. Yeah.
I have a question. And Ivan, do you? How do you think? How do you see? I mean, I know it's an impossible question, but I will still ask it. You know, how do you see the chances for the war in Ukraine to finish with the sensible peace agreement? Do you see any?
So there is probably some. I'm not optimistic that in the short run this is going to happen. I'm afraid that we're going to see much more frozen conflict, because for the Russian president, basically withdrawing from the position in which they had been means recognizing defeat, which is going to destabilize him domestically. And I cannot imagine basically him taking the risk of doing this. For the Russian side, basically to prevail militarily without having a mass mobilization, which is also going to be very domestically unpopular, is according to, I'm not a military expert at all, but what I'm reading, this is not happening. And to be honest, the offensive of the last 3 weeks didn't go very far. So you can much more expect a situation in which you're going to have a ceasefire, and I can easily see somewhere at the end of summer a ceasefire, but the ceasefire which is not becoming which is not becoming a real peace settlement. And then comes how this is going to affect the economic part of the war. I was talking to a senior American official, so I said, tell me what are the conditions under which the United States is going to leave economic sanctions over Russia with Putin staying in office. And they told me something which is very interesting, that in my view it was also honest. A senior person in the administration told me, listen, Ivan, if the president even decided to do it, the Congress is not going to support it. The only way for the economic sanctions to be lifted is if President Zelensky personally come to the American Congress and ask for this to happen as a part of a peace deal for which Ukraine goes. So as a result of it, you can end up with kind of a less people being killed on the ground, but the situation of the economic war going for a longer time. And it's going to have consequences on all sides, also much outside of Europe. So, and also I very much agree with the comment that I understand that you have been discussing. I don't believe, unlike many people, that what really motivated Putin was fear of Ukrainians' democracy. Ukraine was not West Germany too, as Russia is Germany. It was economically in a difficult position. Even if Ukraine was an authoritarian state, he was going to attack them. By the way, he annexed de facto Belarus, what we're not talking about. And part of the reason is that he also has his demographic kind of obsessions, the idea that he should reunify the Russian nations in his lifetime, because he does not trust his successors and he believes that if situation works against him. So as a result of it, democracy, authoritarianism divide does not explain well this war, also because of the fact that President Biden invited 111 countries on this summit of democracy. The majority of them do not sanction Russia. In my view, it's a much more better explained in the terms of a decolonization and basically recolonization than in the terms of a kind of a Cold War clash between democracies and authoritarianism. But I'm not particularly optimistic for peace settlement. Basically, you can get a kind of stopping the hostilities probably somewhere in the autumn, but a large peace settlement in which both sides are going to agree on something and they're going to be international order in which they're going to be guarantees and so on. I'm quite skeptical about this.
Okay, I suggest we stop here if there are no other questions. Also, we took quite more time from Ivan and Vlasta than originally meant, but with this technical interruption, it is probably.
And sorry so much. I feel so guilty, basically wasting your time. But nobody is the boss of his computer.
Yes, don't worry. We had quite interesting discussion, and we were constantly hoping you will come back, and that happened at the end, and that is also good. Without you, it would be different to close this session and this talk. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Ivan, taking time for us. Thank you, Vlasta, for excellent interview, and hope to see you soon in another occasion.